My father contracted me to a brothel to pay his gambling debt. The place he sent me to, he had visited himself 14 times, while my mother was dying in her bedroom, and I was begging him for medicine money. And when I walked out of that place 3 months later, I didn't just walk out. I walked out carrying everything I needed to destroy him. This is that story. I want you to picture a Tuesday morning in Dusty Creek, Texas, 1874. The sun is barely up. The kitchen smells like biscuit dough and wood smoke. I am 19 years old, standing at the stove in my mother's apron, the one with the small blue flowers she embroidered herself, and I am thinking about nothing except whether the biscuits will burn. That was the last ordinary moment of my life. My father, Earl Hollis, came through the back door at 6:30. He had been out all night. I could tell by the way he moved, slow and careful. The way a man moves when he is ashamed of something but not ashamed enough to stop doing it. He smelled like whiskey and cigarettes, and something else I had learned not to name out loud. He sat down at the table without speaking. I put a plate in front of him. I poured his coffee. I sat across from him the way I had done every morning for 7 years, ever since Mama died. And I became, without anyone asking me, the woman who ran this house. He stared at his plate for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it with his palm slowly, like he had been rehearsing this moment, and he slid it across the table toward me. I looked at him first. His eyes were on the table. I picked up the paper. It took me 3 reads to understand what I was holding. My brain kept refusing it the way your mind refuses something that is too wrong to be real. But the words were plain. The signature was plain. The name at the top of the document was plain. The Crimson Lantern Brothel. 3 months of contracted service. Sarah May Hollis. Signed, Earl J. Hollis. I set the paper down very carefully. My hands were shaking. I said, "Daddy, what did you do?" Not a question. I already knew. I just needed to hear what he would say. He said, "You'll earn it back, Sarah May. 3 months and we're square. Think of it as work." He laughed. I looked up at my father, the man who had held my hand at my mother's funeral, the man I had cooked breakfast for every single morning for 7 years, the man I had believed, truly believed, would never let anything bad happen to me because I was all he had left. I said, "Daddy, please, please don't do this." He did not look at me. I got up from my chair. I went around the table, and I knelt down beside him like a child, like a little girl, like the 12-year-old who used to climb into his lap during thunderstorms. And I took his hand in both of mine and I said, "Daddy, I am your daughter. Please, I am begging you. Please don't send me there. We will find another way. I will work. I will take in sewing. I will sell the East Field. Please, look at me. Please." He looked at me then, finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was worse than anger, worse than hatred. It was something flat and decided and already done, the look of a man who has made his choice and is now just waiting for the consequences to be over. He said, "It's already signed, Sarah May. It's done." He looked back at his plate. I stayed on my knees beside him for a moment longer, my hands still holding his, my face still turned up toward him. Then I stood up. I went to my room. I packed one bag. my mother's old wool wrap, a change of clothes, my small journal, and 2 pencils. I came back to the kitchen. My father was standing now, coat on, hat in hand. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm taking you there myself." "Can't have you running off, Sarah May," his own daughter, walking her to the door himself, like a man delivering something he could not afford to keep. I thought about running. I was younger. I was faster, but I had no money, no family, and a signed legal contract working against me. Running would only make it worse. So I walked, and my father walked beside me 2 miles down that dirt road without saying a single word, side by side, like strangers. When we reached the Crimson Lantern, he stopped at the door. He did not come inside. He just stood there on the street, hat in hand, and watched the door close between us. But here is what I did not know yet, what I would not discover until 3 weeks later, that would change everything I thought I understood about my father, about my mother, and about the place he was sending me. Stay with me, because what I found in that ledger, I was not ready for it, and neither are you. The most dangerous places don't look dangerous. They look clean. They look almost beautiful. That's how they keep you. The Crimson Lantern was not what I expected. I had built a picture in my mind during that long walk into town, something dark and broken down, something that looked like what it was, something ugly enough to match the ugliness of what my father had done. Instead, I found a white painted building with green shutters and flower boxes in the windows, oil lamps glowing warm and gold through the glass, the smell of good cooking drifting out through the front door. Virgil Macready Big Vic, as the town called him, met me in the front hall. He was not what I expected either. He was a trim, quiet man in a gray suit, silver watch chain, clean hands. He spoke softly and looked directly at you when he talked, which most men in Dusty Creek did not bother to do. He explained my situation the way a banker explains a loan professionally, calmly, without cruelty, and without kindness. The contract my father had signed was clear full service, no exceptions. That was the deal Earl Hollis had agreed to without blinking. But Vic looked at me for a long moment across that clean desk, the way a man looks at something he has decided to keep for himself. I was not like the other women he had received. I was composed. I was presentable. I looked him directly in the eye when he spoke, which most women in that chair did not do. He made a decision that night that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with possession. He said, "You will serve at my private dinner table. You will pour drinks, bring food, and be present when my guests require it. Nothing more than that for now." "That last part, for now," he said quietly, almost to himself. I understood exactly what it meant. He was not protecting me. He was saving me for himself. And that distinction, that particular kind of danger, was something I had to think about very carefully as I walked to my small room that first night. He gestured to a small room off the back hallway. Clean bed, small window, a hook on the wall for my coat. "Do you have any questions?" he asked. I looked around that room. The clean floor, the neatly folded blanket, the small lamp on the table. I said, "May I keep a journal? For my personal comfort?" He shrugged. "I don't see why not." That was his first mistake, and it was the only mistake I needed him to make. The second person I met at the Crimson Lantern was old Clara Weston. She found me in the kitchen my first morning, standing at the back window, staring at the alley, trying to decide whether to run. She was 60-something, with white hair pinned tight and eyes that had seen everything twice. She put a cup of coffee on the counter in front of me and sat down across the table without being invited. She said, "You've got that look." I said, "What look?" She said, "That dangerous, quiet look. The last girl who had it ran, got caught 3 miles out." I said, "I'm not running." She looked at me for a long moment. Really looked the way old women look when they're deciding whether you're worth their time. Then she said, "Good. Running is for women with nowhere to go. You need to build somewhere first." Clara had been at the Crimson Lantern for 20 years. She ran the kitchen, managed the younger women, kept order. She had survived by making herself indispensable to Vic. She knew everything that happened in that building. She knew every name, every secret, every arrangement. And for reasons she didn't explain until much later, she had been waiting for someone she could trust with all of it. Every evening, I served at Vic's private dinner table. Important men from Dusty Creek and the surrounding counties. Land brokers. A commissioner named Gerald Finch, who laughed too loud and talked too freely. A cattle baron named Silas Drummond, who constantly looked over his shoulder. A judge, a reverend from the church on Caldwell Street. They talked in front of me about land deals and legal cases and money owed and favors traded, about which sheriff could be bought and for how much, about arrangements they had made with Vic that their wives and congregations knew nothing about. None of them looked at my face long enough to worry about what I was hearing. Every night, after midnight, I wrote it all down. Names, dates, amounts, exact words when I could remember them. The journal filled faster than I expected. And then came the night 3 weeks in, when Percy the bookkeeper left the records room unlocked. Let me tell you about Percy first, because he matters more than he looks like he does. Percy Hobbs was Vic's head bookkeeper. A small, thin man, maybe 40 years old, maybe 50. Hard to tell. He wore the same brown vest every day and kept his pen tucked behind his right ear even when he was not working. He ate his lunch alone in the corner of the kitchen, eyes down, speaking to no one. He flinched when doors slammed. He apologized before anyone had said anything wrong. He was the kind of man that a room full of people looked straight through, invisible by habit, invisible by survival. Every single dollar that moved through the Crimson Lantern passed through Percy's hands first. Every name, every date, every arrangement. It was all in his ledger, in his small, careful handwriting, locked in the records room at the end of the back hallway. Nobody was kind to Percy. Not Vic. Not the guests. Not even the other women in the building, not out of cruelty, but simply because nobody noticed him enough to bother. I noticed him on my second day. I remembered his name on my third. I asked about his headache on my fourth. He had mentioned it once, quietly, to no one in particular. He looked up at me like I had said something in a foreign language. I left the better biscuits on his side of the breakfast table every morning after that. 3 weeks later, Percy left the records room unlocked. He thought he was simply being kind to a woman in a hard situation. He had no idea what he had just handed me. When I walked into that records room and opened Vic's main ledger, I was looking for the details of my own contract, the exact debt amount, the payment structure. What I found instead stopped me cold. Page 11, a name I recognized, Earl J. Hollis, and next to it, 14 entries, 6 months of dates, 14 Friday nights. I stood very still in that room for a long time. My father had been coming here, to this place. While I was home cooking his meals and mending his shirts and keeping his failing ranch from falling to pieces, he was here. 14 times. And the dates, God, the dates. 3 of those Fridays were during the weeks when my mother's medicine bottle sat empty on her nightstand, and she coughed herself to sleep. And I sat beside her bed and held her hand and prayed. I closed the ledger carefully. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed. I gave myself one night to feel all of it. In the morning, I went back to the records room and I copied every entry with my father's name, twice. Once for me, once for Clara, and that is when the real plan began. But there is one more thing I have not told you yet. One thing Clara told me the following night about what my father did to my mother long before I was old enough to understand it. Something so dark that when I finally heard it, I understood that this moment, this contract, this betrayal, it was not the first time. It was just the first time he used me. Clara came to me on a Thursday night, late. She brought 2 cups of strong coffee and sat down on the end of my bed, like she had been deciding whether to say this for a long time and had finally made up her mind. She said, "There's something you need to know about your daddy in this place, about your mama too." I said, "Tell me." And she did. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, too small to remember clearly, my father's gambling debts broke us for the first time. He borrowed money from men he should not have borrowed from. He lost cattle he did not yet own. He was desperate in the way that desperate men become dangerous. And he came to Vic McCready with an offer. He sat in this same building, in Vic's same office, and he offered his wife, my mother, Margaret Ann Hollis. Gentle, patient, smart Margaret offered to Vic like she was livestock, like she was property that could be traded to settle a balance. Vic was interested. The arrangement was discussed. My father went home and told my mother. Clara paused here. She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "Your mama. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at your daddy across that kitchen table and she said, 'I will not, and if you ever speak of this again, I will leave and take Sarah with me.'" My father backed down. Not because he felt shame, but because he was afraid of losing the woman who kept his house running. But 3 years later, he tried again. He had been drinking for 3 days when he went back to Vic without telling my mother first. He made the offer again. Vic's bookkeeper, a different man back then, mentioned it in passing to a woman in town who told another woman who told my mother. My mother packed my small bag and her own on a Tuesday morning before my father woke up. We lived in a boarding house in the next county for 8 months. My mother took in sewing. We were poor, really poor, the kind where you count every biscuit. But she sang in the mornings. She braided my hair. She laughed at small things. I have 5 or 6 memories from that time, and they are the warmest memories I have of my childhood. Then my father hired a lawyer, a man who owed him a favor, and filed for legal custody of me. In 1860s Texas, the law almost always gave children to the father. My mother had no money for a lawyer. She had no powerful friends. She had nothing but the truth. And in that courthouse, the truth lost. My father won. I was ordered returned to his custody. My mother had a choice. Leave without me, or go back. She went back. She never sang in the mornings again after that. Not once. Not in all the years I can remember. I used to wonder why. I thought it was just grief, just tiredness, just the way some women get quieter as they get older. Now, I understood. She had not gotten quieter. She had gotten careful. She was a woman living inside a trap, staying in it by choice, because her daughter was in the trap too and she refused to leave me alone in it. Clara said. She knew what he was. She stayed for you. Only for you, I said. He let her die, Clara said. Yes, because that is the part that I have to say plainly, because it is the part that is hardest to carry. In the winter of 1867, my mother got sick. A lung sickness started as a cough, ended as silence. The doctor said she needed medicine, rest, and proper food. The medicine cost money. My father spent that money at the card table. I was 12 years old when I stood in front of him with her empty medicine bottle in my hand and said, "Daddy, she needs this. Please." He said he would handle it. He rode to town. He came back 4 hours later, drunk, empty-handed, $11 deeper in debt. My mother died 6 weeks later, in her bedroom. On a cold February morning, I was sitting beside her, holding her hand, alone because my father was asleep downstairs and did not hear anything. Sitting on that bed in the crimson lantern, listening to Clara finish the story, I did the math that I had been refusing to do for years. The same man who watched my mother die, rather than buy her medicine, had visited this place, this exact building, 14 times in the months that followed. He had money for that. He had found money for that. I looked at Clara, and I said, "She came back for me. She gave up everything and came back for me." Clara said, "Yes," I said. "Then I'm not going to waste it." I opened my journal. I picked up my pencil, and I started writing the list that would eventually bring every one of them down. Hey, if you're watching this right now, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. City, state, wherever you are. And if this story is hitting you in the chest the way I think it is, hit that subscribe button, because Sarah's story is not over yet. The part that's coming, the part where she fights back, that's the reason I wanted to tell this story in the first place. Don't leave. Here is what most people get wrong about women in impossible situations. They think we fall apart. They think we spend our days weeping and our nights praying for rescue. They think we are waiting for someone to come through the door and save us. I was not waiting for anyone. I had a journal, 2 pencils, and 3 months inside a building full of secrets. That was enough. Every evening I served at Vic's dinner table. Every night I wrote names, words, amounts. The judge who came twice in 1 week. The commissioner who bragged about a land deal he had arranged illegally. The cattle baron who whispered to Vic about a payment he needed to make disappear from the county record. They talked freely in front of me, because they had already decided I did not matter. That decision was the most expensive one they ever made. Percy, the bookkeeper, who I had already won over with simple kindness in my first weeks, became my most important resource. Completely without realizing it, within a month of my arrival, he was leaving the records room unlocked on Tuesday afternoons, without being asked. He thought he was just being kind to a woman in a difficult situation. He did not understand that every Tuesday afternoon I was cross-referencing his ledger against my journal and building a document that would eventually reach a lawyer in San Antonio. Clara helped where she could. She had 20 years of knowledge about this place. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors had listening spots, which of Vic's arrangements were the most damaging. She shared all of it slowly, carefully, in the quiet hours after midnight. And then, at the end of my 6th week, a man named Thomas Reed rode into Dusty Creek. Let me tell you about Thomas Reed, because he is not the hero of this story. I am. But he is the one person outside these walls who treated me like a human being from the very first moment. And that matters. Thomas Reed was 28 years old, a cattle broker from San Antonio, passing through Dusty Creek on business. He was not a loud man, not a flashy man. Medium height, good coat, steady eyes. The kind of man who shakes your hand and actually looks at you when he does it. Not past you, not through you, at you. He had money and connections and a conscience which, in 1874 Texas, was a rarer combination than gold. He was brought to Vic's dinner table by Silas Drummond as a courtesy to a visiting businessman. Standard practice for men of means passing through town. He sat at that table. He ate his meal. And unlike every other man in that room, he watched me work with something other than appetite or indifference. He watched the way a careful person watches when something does not add up. He saw a woman moving through that room like someone memorizing a map, and he was smart enough to find that interesting instead of threatening. That was the difference between Thomas Reed and every other man who sat at Vic's table. He noticed my face. After dinner, in the back hallway, I stopped him. I said, "I need one thing from you. A letter of credit from your bank in San Antonio, opened under the name Margaret Hollis." He blinked. He said, "That's your mother's name." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at me, really looked, the way Thomas Reed always looked at things he was deciding about. Then he said, "How much?" I told him exactly. I had calculated it to the dollar. Enough to open a dry goods supply account. Enough to start something real. He sent the letter 4 days later, through Clara's address. No questions. No conditions. That letter was the foundation of everything that came after. Not because I needed rescuing, I did not need rescuing. But because you cannot build a future with your bare hands alone. Sometimes you need one person to hand you the first brick. Thomas Reed handed me the first brick. Now came the part that required patience. I needed 3 things before I could walk into Vic's office and lay my cards on the table. First, documentation strong enough that Vic would know I was serious. I had the journal. I had the ledger copies. I needed something more. Second, signatures. Statements from women inside the Crimson Lantern who would be willing to testify if it came to that. This was the hardest part. These women had their own fears, their own reasons for staying silent. I could not push. I could only be present, be trustworthy, be patient. I spent 3 weeks doing nothing but being reliable, covering shifts when someone was tired, sharing food, listening without judgment, never asking for anything in return. When I finally asked quietly, one at a time, with a clear explanation of what I was doing and what it might cost them, 3 women said yes. 3 women I will not name here, to protect them. But they said yes, and they signed. and I kept their statements folded inside the lining of my mother's shawl where no one would look for them. Third, I needed the right moment. The moment Vic himself handed me. I did not have to wait long. And what happened on the night? He called me into his office at the end of 3 months. What he said to me, what he thought he was going to get away with, that is the moment this whole story has been building toward. But first, there is one more thing. Something I found in that ledger that I haven't told you yet. Something about a date that I almost missed. A date that, when I finally saw it, made my hands go completely still for the first time in 3 months. It was the date 3 days before my mother died. My father's name was on that page too. At the end of 3 months, Vic called me into his office. I had been waiting for this meeting. I had been preparing for this meeting since the first week. I walked in with my folder under my arm, and I sat down across from his clean desk, and his oil lamp, and his quiet, careful face. He smiled first, that soft, business-like smile. He said there were expenses I had not accounted for. Room and board, clothing allowance, a small administrative fee. He slid a new paper across the desk, a new number, larger than the original debt. The contract was being extended. I looked at the new paper. I looked at his face. I said, "I see." Then I placed my folder on his desk. He looked at it without touching it. Men like Vic have instincts, he could tell. From the weight of it, from the way I placed it, that this was not a letter, and it was not a plea. He opened it. Inside, in order, first 12 pages from my journal. 12 names, with dates, amounts, and documented conversations. Commissioner Gerald Finch, Judge Beaumont, Silas Drummond, the Reverend from Caldwell Street, 8 others. Every entry cross-referenced against the ledger in Percy's handwriting. Second, 3 signed statements. 3 women willing to testify. Names and dates and specific details that no one could claim were invented. Third, my father's 14 ledger entries, copied in my own handwriting. Every date, every amount, every Friday night, while my mother was dying, and I was begging him for medicine money. Fourth, a sealed letter, addressed to the editor of the San Antonio Daily Express, not mailed, yet held by Clara Weston, with instructions to mail it if I did not return from this meeting by sundown. Vic read through every page. He took his time. His expression barely changed men who have operated in the dark as long as Vic are trained to keep their faces still. But his hands were not moving, the kind of stillness that means the mind is running very fast. When he finished, he looked up at me. I said, "You can extend my contract. You can try to keep me here. That is your choice to make." I paused. "Or you can sign this." I placed a second document in front of him. My contract voided and released, effective immediately. A transfer of the boarding house and legitimate lodging operations to Clara Weston, making her a protected party that no future arrangement could touch, and a deed of release, already notarized, waiting only for his signature. I said, "I'm leaving 1 copy of everything in that folder on this desk, regardless of what you decide, so that every time you sit at this desk, you know exactly what exists and exactly who has it." Silence. The lamp flickered once. Vic looked at the folder. He looked at the judge's name on page 1. He looked at Commissioner Finch's entry, the conversation about the Henderson land case, about Judge Beaumont already agreeing to rule in Finch's favor. He looked at the Reverend's name. He thought about what it would cost him if that letter reached San Antonio. He thought about what it would cost him if those 3 women testified. He thought about the 12 names, 12 men who had money and power and absolutely no interest in being publicly connected to the Crimson Lantern. He picked up his pen. He signed. I stood up. I picked up the folder, left 1 copy, took the rest. I put on my mother's shawl. I walked to the door. Vic said very quietly, "You planned this from the beginning." I stopped with my hand on the door frame. I turned and looked at him one last time. I said, "My mother taught me that the only way to survive a man who sees you as property is to become the one thing he cannot afford to own." I walked out. I did not run. What happened in that office after I left, I did not see with my own eyes. But Clara did. She was in the hallway, close enough to hear everything through the gap in the door. She told me every word of it that same morning. And I will tell you now, because this is the part that proves that the most dangerous trap is not the one built with iron bars. It is the one built with uncertainty. Within 2 minutes of my leaving, Vic called for Percy. Percy came in with his ledger under his arm, the way he always did, small, nervous, already apologizing before anyone had said anything wrong. Vic did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He simply placed the folder on the desk in front of Percy and pointed to the copied entries, the ledger pages in Sarah's handwriting, and said, "How many copies of this exist?" Percy looked at the pages. His face went the color of old flour. He said, I don't know, sir." Vic said, "You left the records room unlocked." Percy said, "I forgot to. I didn't think she would." Vic held up one hand. Percy stopped talking immediately. Vic said, "I am going to ask you one more time. How many copies? Who has them? Where are they?" Percy's hands were shaking. He said, "Sir, I truly do not know. I never saw her make copies. I don't know how many times she was in there. I don't know who she gave them to. I don't know." Silence. Vic looked at the folder for a long time. He looked at the sealed letter Sarah had left on the desk, the one addressed to the San Antonio Daily Express editor. She had left it deliberately, unopened, just sitting there so he could see exactly what it was and exactly where it was going if anything went wrong. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands once. Then he set it back down without opening it. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "She could have given copies to anyone. A lawyer, a judge in another county, the newspaper, anyone." Percy said nothing. There was nothing to say. Vic said, "And I have no way of knowing who already has it." That was the moment. That was the moment Vic McCready, a man who had operated in the dark for 20 years, who had controlled this town through secrets and arrangements, and the quiet power of knowing things about people, understood that he was now on the other side of that equation. He did not know what Sarah had. He did not know who she had given it to. He did not know when it might be used, or how, or by whom. He had signed the contract because he calculated it was the safest move, but signing it had not made him safe. It had only made him careful, and careful, for a man like Vic, was a prison with no walls and no door, just the permanent, unshakable knowledge that somewhere out there, a 19-year-old girl with her dead mother's shawl and a journal full of names held everything she needed to end him. whenever she chose. Clara told me all of this on the back steps, over coffee, while the sun came up. When she finished, she looked at me sideways and said, "He's going to be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup. I said, "Good." Clara was on the back steps with 2 cups of coffee. She stood when she saw my face. She said, "Done?" I said, "Done." She handed me the coffee. We sat together in the early morning quiet. The wide, still quiet that comes after something hard is finally finished. And we watched the sun come up over Dusty Creek. Before we get to the final chapter, I have to stop and ask you something directly. If you have been watching this story, and something in it feels familiar, a parent who failed you, a person who was supposed to protect you, and chose not to, I want you to know that this story is for you. Not just Sarah's survival. Your survival too. Hit that like button right now if this story has moved you, and share it with someone who needs to hear that the people who broke you do not get to write the ending. What happened when Sarah faced her father is the one that will stay with you. Let's finish this. I rode to the Hollis Ranch the same morning. The sun was fully up by the time I turned onto the long dirt track that led to the house. I had ridden this track 10,000 times in my life. Going to school, coming back from town, running to the barn in rainstorms. I knew every rut, every bend, every place where the mesquite trees grew close on both sides and made a kind of tunnel. It looked smaller than I remembered. The whole property looked smaller. The house, the barn, the broken fence on the east side that my father had been meaning to fix for 6 years. It all looked like what it was, a place that had been slowly falling apart for a very long time, held together only by the daily work of women who deserved better. My father was on the porch. He stood up when he saw me coming, and I watched his face from a distance, watched the expressions move across it as I got closer. Hope, guilt, rehearsed words, the half smile of a man who has been waiting to be forgiven and has convinced himself that love smooths everything over eventually. He raised one hand in a small wave. I did not wave back. I dismounted at the fence. I tied my horse. I walked up to the porch and stood in front of him. He said, "Sarah May." I said, "I found your name in the ledger." The half smile dissolved. His hand dropped. 14 times, Daddy. 14 Friday nights. The same place you sent me. He opened his mouth. "Don't." He closed it. I looked at him, really looked. The way I had looked at him across the kitchen table 3 months ago, when he slid that contract toward me and laughed his small, nervous laugh. I looked at the man who had been my father for 19 years. The man who took me back from my mother through the courts because he needed someone to run his house. The man who had sat in Vic McCready's office twice and offered the women in his family as payment for his debts. I said, "You tried to sell Mama first. Twice. She told me some of it before she died. I found the rest myself." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "She left once, when I was 7. I remember being happy that year. I remember she sang in the mornings. I didn't know why we left. Now I do. She came back because you took me through the courts. She gave up her freedom, the only safe life she had found, because she would not leave me alone with you. She came back and she stayed in that house, and she went quiet and stopped singing because she had made her choice, and her choice was me." My voice was steady. I had not planned to be steady. I had thought maybe I would cry, maybe I would shout, but there was nothing left to spill. I had cried it all out months ago, in that small room in the Crimson Lantern, in the dark, after midnight, with my journal in my lap. What was left was just truth, plain and flat and unchangeable as the Texas ground under our feet. The winter she got sick, the medicine cost $3. The doctor told you 3 times. I told you once, with the empty bottle in my hand. You said you would handle it. You rode to town. Earl Hollis sat down on the porch step. Slowly, like a man whose legs no longer work properly. She died in February. I was sitting next to her. You were asleep downstairs. You could not hear anything because you had been drinking. And 2 months later, I found your name in that ledger. The Friday night started 2 months after we put her in the ground. He was looking at the dirt in front of the porch step. His hands were clasped between his knees. He looked old. He looked exactly as old as he was. And somehow, also older. Like the weight of what I was saying had added years to him while I watched. I said, "She gave her whole life to keep me close to her. And you spent that same life building the debt that you would eventually use to send me to the same place you had been going yourself." I reached into my coat. I placed a folded paper on the porch step beside him. "That is a letter. Everything I just told you written down. Dated. Signed. You are going to read it every time you think about forgetting. So, you cannot forget. So you have to live knowing that I know. All of it." Earl Hollis looked at the letter. He did not pick it up. He said, in a voice I barely recognized, thin and cracked and very small, "Sarah May, I'm sorry." I looked at him one last time. I said, "I know, that's not enough. But I believe you." I paused. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because my mother forgave people who didn't deserve it. And she was the best person I ever knew. So I am going to do what she did. I am going to forgive you, and I am going to walk away, and I am going to build something she would have been proud of. But forgiving you is not the same as trusting you, and it is not the same as coming back." I turned toward my horse. He said, "Where will you go?" I untied the reins. I put my foot in the stirrup. I looked back at him one time, from horseback, from above, and I said, "Somewhere Mama would have liked." I rode back to Dusty Creek. I did not look back at the house. I did not need to. What happened after? Commissioner Gerald Finch resigned 4 months later. He moved his family to another county. His wife never fully knew why. Judge Beaumont retired quietly. No ceremony, no explanation. Silas Drummond lost a major land investment when his private arrangements became known to his investors in Austin. He called it bad luck. He was wrong. Deputy Hank Greer resigned his badge 6 weeks after I left the Crimson Lantern. He started showing up at Clara's boarding house on Saturday mornings to help with repairs. Nobody said anything. Clara didn't lock the back gate on Saturdays anymore. Big Vic McCready never left Dusty Creek. Men like Vic never leave. But he became quieter, more careful. He knew that somewhere in the hands of people, he could not track the documentation existed. He did not know exactly what I had given to whom, or when I might use it again. That uncertainty was the most powerful thing I left him with. Not the fear of what had already happened, the fear of what could still happen. Clara Weston now ran the legitimate side of the Crimson Lantern's operation. The boarding house, the lodging, the meals. Over the following year, More women quietly found their way to Clara's side of the ledger, and out the other end, Vic never stopped it. He had learned the cost of underestimating women who plan carefully and move slowly. I opened my dry goods supply store on a Thursday morning in early spring. I named the account Margaret Hollis Trading Co. The first week I sold flour, salt, and lamp oil. The second week, I had 4 regular customers. By the end of the first year, I had hired 1 assistant, a young widow named Dottie Crane, with 2 children and a debt her husband had left her. I paid her a fair wage. I gave her Sundays free. I never asked her to explain her circumstances. Thomas Reed passed back through Dusty Creek 11 months later. He stopped in front of the store and read the sign above the door, Margaret Hollis Trading Co., and something moved across his face that I did not have a name for yet, but would later. He came inside. He looked at the neat shelves, the clean counter, my own ledger open on the desk with my own numbers and my own name at the top of every page. He took off his hat. He said, "You built it." I looked up from the ledger. I said, "I had a good reason." He stayed in Dusty Creek 3 days longer than his business required. The town noticed. The town always notices. But nobody said anything unkind, because Sarah May Hollis had become the kind of woman that even a hard, small, sun-beaten town eventually learns not to cross. On a Sunday evening in October, 6 months after the store opened, I rode out to the small cemetery on the eastern edge of town. I knelt beside a simple stone marker. Margaret Ann Hollis, 1832, 1867. Beloved. I put my hand flat on the ground, the way I used to hold her hand. I said, "I named it after you. The account, the store. All of it is under your name now, Mama. So your name means something that nobody can take or sell or sign away." I kept going, like you did. The store is doing well. Clara is safe. The men who thought they could use us, they are quieter now. I think you'd be all right with how it turned out. The sun finished setting. The sky went from pink to purple, to the deep, still blue of a Texas evening. I stood up. I brushed the grass from my knees. I got on my horse. I rode back to town, back to the store, back to my ledger and my name, and the life I had built from the wreckage of everything he had tried to take from me. The lantern above the Margaret Hollis Trading Co. burned all night. It was the brightest light on the street. And to anyone watching this right now, who has ever been sold out by someone who was supposed to love them, who was failed by a parent, betrayed by family, left alone in a hard place with nothing but their own 2 hands and their own stubborn will to survive, Sarah's story is yours too. You don't have to burn it all down. You just have to build something they cannot take. Something they have to drive past every day. Something bright enough that it lights the whole street. Sarah May Hollis, Dusty Creek, Texas, 1876. If this story moved you, share it. Someone you know needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because Sarah's story is one of many. We tell them all here.